So we're still working our way through James. Today we're finishing chapter 3, going into chapter 4. And we're looking at yet another false picture of reality that James felt like we needed to deal with. So here, try this. See if you can finish this phrase for me. It's my way or?
My way.
Okay. How about don't let the door hit you?
In the back. We don't want to say that.
Yeah, that's right. Even at the campground, they wouldn't say that. It was like, this is still church. We can't say that. But you know the phrase, quitters never win and... That's right. We live in a world that teaches us that we have to get our way. You stand up for yourself, you stick to your guns, and you'll do it your way, right? I mean, that's what it's all about. That's what we're taught. And somehow, perhaps because of that dedication to getting our way, there's just conflict everywhere. I mean, we even create it where there isn't any. When we're getting along, we manage to make conflict. This is a great story from some years back. Argentina and Chile worked together, South American countries. They wanted to kind of have a symbol of their unity and their peace and their shared values, and so they built together the Christ of the Andes, this wonderful statue of Jesus, reminiscent of the one in Brazil, and standing there in the mountains between the two countries. And it had hardly been started when people in Chile started saying, well, wait, why does Jesus have his back turned to us? And they started getting more and more upset. Tempers were flaring. And finally, a very wise person calmed the crowd by saying, well, the Argentinians just need more looking after than we do. And that calmed down. But look, this unity of peace, symbol of unity and peace, suddenly became a point of contention. Is that not people in action right there? That's what we do. We're so prone to conflict. You look at a newspaper, turn on the news on TV, and there's conflict everywhere. There's conflict between nations. There's conflict within nations. Even the church, which should be, the place where the peace of God is on display, somehow conflict works its way into the church too. It's everywhere. Denominational churches, it's just there's always something for us to argue about. And then, goodness, keeping on going, and we have our families, that are built on blood and love, and conflict finds its way. Even in there, we get hurt feelings, broken relationships. Sometimes we just can't get along. And so here James saw the same things going on then that we see going on now. And he wanted to talk about why this happens, and fortunately also what we can do about it. We hate to know a problem and not talk about what we can do. So we get both today. James is being as kind as he can be for a very straightforward kind of guy. So we're actually picking this up partway through chapter 13. Remember, when James wrote this, there were no chapters and verses. You remember that, right? This was just a letter. So the divisions are artificial. Those were put in later so that we could find things together. But this last part of chapter 3 is clearly the setup for what he's talking about in chapter 4. So this is 3:13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace, raise the harvest of righteousness. So, and then moving into chapter 4. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something, but don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. James. It's good that he doesn't beat around the bush, but this is a hard one to swallow. Conflict comes from within us, from our desires, and when they are at odds with the desires of other people. And that's what makes the sparks fly. It's that both of us want something and we want to get our way. And what we do as humans is we try to make it where everybody else has the problem and we don't. I want you to, let's do a little something. Look at somebody beside you, or somewhere around, and just say, "It's your fault." Just, okay. Some of you are like, "How is this different from all the other times?" That came a little too easy, didn't it? It's all your fault. That's just what we do. That is human nature. Because when we feel even the slight tinge, we'll just call it guilt. I don't know if that's the right word, but when we feel within us some sense that we're in the wrong or that we messed up or something, our reflex is to make it somebody else's fault. Because we hate feeling bad. We don't want to feel guilty and wrong. We want to be right, and we want the high ground. And so rather than just saying, "Well, I messed up," our reflex is to immediately think, who can I scapegoat here? Who can I throw this off on? And I've caught myself, it's people. I've caught myself when I did something dumb, trying to work out in my mind how I could make it Tracy's fault. Unfortunately, in our marriage, everything's my fault whether I did it or not. But I was working, I caught myself doing that, thinking, well, she did. And I'm like, come on. Come on. I'm just trying to wiggle out of it because I don't want to feel guilty. I don't want to feel like I messed up. And that is how we are. It is our fundamental wiring. That is our worldly wiring that makes us want to make it somebody else's fault. We will blame our spouse. We'll blame our kids. We'll blame the traffic. We'll blame that slow person in front of us in line. Somebody else did this to us. And we make ourselves victims instead of the one messing it, right? I mean, we do it. Hopefully we catch ourselves and put a stop. But it happens. We do this all the time. But and here's James saying, and again, they did the same thing. We're not singling ourselves out. This is what people do. And James is saying, look, stop looking around and pointing fingers. Stop saying, hey, this is all your fault. Look within. Because even if it really is mostly somebody else's fault, usually we have a part to play. Is that fair to say? In any given conflict, there's probably multiple parts to it. And so, there's the great saying, it takes two to tango. Everybody who does marriage therapy, they know that any given problem, okay, those are amens, I'm just telling you. If a couple comes in and says, the husband's the problem, that's not the problem. There may be a person starting it, but there's a couple is a unity, right? It's one thing. Just like if a family comes in for family therapy and says, this kid is our problem, that's never true. That's just the one that's acting out. Every problem is a family problem. Does that make sense? Are you hearing me? And everybody has a part. You've probably known people, I hope you're not one of them, but you've seen this, where, this is a classic, the parents like, Junior just won't listen to me. I don't understand. He's such a problem. Well, guess how that happens? Yeah, you don't have to guess because you've seen it. And you're sitting there thinking, Everybody around you knows why he acts that way. It's systemic. So there's always many sides to the story, but we try to make it something simple where one person is at fault and probably not us. We don't like to be in the wrong. And so really we make a lot of allowances, not quite excuses. Man, that's a bad word. I don't like that. We are easier on ourselves because we understand how things go. And so, like when I do something that I really shouldn't, I'm able to understand it, because I can think of the terrible day that I had and how tired I was and how my kids wouldn't leave me alone and how stressed out I was. I'm like, I was just having a bad day. I was weak, so I understand. I'm not going to be hard on myself here because I know why that happened. But when somebody else does the same thing, I'm like, boy, he is one awful person. Right? Where we just say, we don't give other people the breaks that we give ourselves. We don't think about that because it's just easier to say that. They're just mean. They're just awful. But we have to be realistic and we have to be more honest with ourselves. Some years ago, eHarmony claimed, I did not investigate this claim, but they said that they reject about 20% of their applicants because they do an honesty test. And the people who check boxes like, I never lose my temper and I always pick up after myself and I always obey the speed limit, they just are like, these people aren't dealing with reality. There's no way we can match them to anybody. Right? Because it can't be true. So we don't want to live in denial. You know people who denial, that is where they live and that's where their brain is. And they're very hard to deal with. It's hard to get serious with someone who can't have an honest conversation that's grounded in reality. But we need to be honest with ourselves first. If we can be truthful with ourselves, then maybe we can aspire to honest, truthful relationships with parents, siblings, spouses, friends, etc. And certainly, if we're not honest with ourselves, it's very hard to have that honest connection to God, right? It's just denial. Every time I say that, I think of Cleopatra. She was the queen of denial, It's like it's a barrier. We're putting something between us and God, and it's that refusal to deal with reality. And so ultimately, that kind of boils down to selfishness, where really, oh poor thing. Really, this is coming down to the setup stuff from the end of chapter 3, where James is saying, look, there's kind of two sides at war here. We have the new person, the spirit-driven person, but each of us within us, we still have who we were, right? We still have that worldly thinking. We have the my way or the highway person that's still in us. And it's easy to see selfishness in other people. It's a little harder when it's us. This is your future right there, buddy. This is how we're all toddlers at heart. So here's the toddler rules of possession. If I like it, it's mine. If it's in my hand, it's mine. If I can take it out of your hand, it's mine. If I had it a little while ago, it's mine. If it's mine, it must never appear to be yours in any way. If I'm doing something or building something, all the pieces I might need are mine. If it looks like something that's mine, it's mine. If I saw it before you saw it, it's mine. If you're playing with something that's yours and you put it down, it's mine. If I break it, it's yours. And we watch that in small children, and it's a riot. But that's who we are. Okay? That's how we start out. It takes years of maturation and training and the work of God for us to be able to not act like toddlers. And you do know some grown-ups that still act like that. It's not automatic. We all have an inner toddler that just wants what we want. And we may not scream and cry anymore, but we still act like that sometimes. And then you have that, but I want it, right? And James is saying, you're unhappy people because you want things and you're not getting them. You want it and you don't get it. You want it when you want it. You want it how you want it. You want people to just accept that all of your ideas are better and do what you say. That's all you're looking for. And really, I mean, the truth is, if everybody else just recognized that I was right, we wouldn't have any conflict. You know, that's kind of how it goes. Not me personally, but that's, You want something, but don't get it. You kill and covet, but you can't have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You don't have because you don't ask God. And when you ask, you don't receive because you ask with the wrong motives. When we let our inner toddler win, when we let the worldly thinking take over, it makes us restless and discontent. We become pleasure-driven. We just want what we want. And the more we give in to that kind of thinking, the more conflict there will be, the more quarreling, the more fighting, the more that kind of stuff. And so just focusing on a few of those key words, there's that idea of coveting. We know that from the 10 Commandments, but it's not just the desiring something else, but the willingness to do whatever it takes to get it. That's what gets us in trouble. I mean, we look at things and say, oh, that's nice. But the coveting is when we start having that drive to have that. And it leads to jealousy and all sorts of nasty stuff. So we want to desire things. We just want to desire good things, godly things. When covetousness gets us to the point when we just want what we want, then we're in trouble. Because then we start getting frustrated, then we start attacking, and the conflict comes in. And then we're not doing things the God way. We're giving in to worldly wisdom and not thinking in a godly way. And when we want things the way we want them, we superimpose that on people, on things, on circumstances, and ultimately we start applying that to God and just, God, you need to do what I want when I want. And you can already see the problem with that. It's a dangerous, dangerous path. And that worldly thinking, you do not have because you do not ask God. When we start thinking that there are other ways to get what we want, that God is not the first option. And some people misuse that, like all you have to do is ask. God is not a heavenly vending machine. It's not like Amazon Prime or something. What he's saying is there's two things that we need to make sure of. We need to ask God for the things that we need, and we need to ask with the right motives. We could have a big prayer meeting and just ask for each of us to have a brand new yacht or for a brand new big TV, and we'd be wasting a lot of time, wouldn't we? Because that would be the wrong motives. If we're going to go to God and ask for things, the right motive is wanting what God wants. And that's where we get back to the spirit-filled versus the worldly style. And you may have noticed, we work very hard to couch all of our praying in terms of God's will. God knows what we want, and it's perfectly fair to tell God that. But all of our requests have to be couched at some level in our desire to see God's will be done, regardless of what we want, right? And we're careful about that because we don't want to start making prayer a selfish thing where we tell God what we want done and when and how. In fact, there was a woman on an online discussion board. Her screen name was ex-Christian, if that tells you anything. She said, "Give me an example of an unselfish prayer. Any prayer is about asking the creator of this vast universe to do something or change something because you want him to, even if you're praying for a stranger to get well. If there is a God, don't you think he's smart enough to figure out what needs to be done and what doesn't? Christians say he works in mysterious ways, and then proceed to tell him how to perform his work. That is a really sad thing from someone who apparently used to do church, but got the wrong idea. There is such a thing as unselfish prayer, but when we make it about us, it comes across like we're just telling God what to do, which makes him not much of a God, right? If you really could order him around, would he be worth serving? No. And so we have to follow in the spirit of Jesus. Not my will, but your will be done. And in verse 4, James says something that's, I'm sure he did this to very purposefully get a charge out of people, because he uses very strong language. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred towards God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. See, it's not just, well, there's worldly and then there's godly. No. You don't have some of each. This is one is bad and one is good. And you may recall, especially in the Old Testament, this theme of Israel being an adulterous nation. They were cheating on God. God was their God. They were his people. You know, Jesus is the groom and the church is his bride. You know, unfaithfulness is not a sexual thing here. It's a spiritual thing. And when we're dallying with the world, when we're thinking about the world, focused on the world, we're cheating on God. That's what James is saying here. And he wants us to know that God is a jealous God. Do you think Scripture says without reason that the Spirit he caused to live in us envies intensely? God really wants our undivided attention and love and devotion, and he deserves it. But that's what he desires from us. And so we see here that these sources of conflict, they're all from within. They're all from our toddler nature, the world at work within us. And we're prone to that, to be spiritually adulterous, to be covetous, to be selfish. And so we have to really latch on to the cure that James offers here. And, it starts with the recognition of what's going on. But he gives, this is verse 6, but he gives us more grace. This is why Scripture says God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. You know, back in the day, I'm sure they still come on, but I don't look for them anymore. But the Charlie Brown specials seem to come on every holiday, and it was a family event to watch whether it was the Christmas one or the big pumpkin or the great pumpkin and all that kind of stuff. But every time the Peanuts got together, one thing you could be sure of was that Lucy would hold the football and Charlie Brown would try to kick it and go, she would move it at the last second and just go flying. Every time, every comic strip, every special, it was just a given. But there was one where she offered, this was a comic, she offered to do it, and Charlie Brown says, I know what you're going to do. You always pull it out of the way, and I go flying and land flat on my back. And she says, you're right. I admit in the past I have played cruel tricks on you, but I have seen the error of my ways. I've seen the hurt in your eyes, Charlie Brown. Won't you give this poor repentant girl one more chance? And being Charlie Brown, he says, sure. And he comes running up. She snatches it out of the way. And while he lays there groaning on the ground, she walks off saying, unfortunately, recognizing your faults and actually changing your ways are two different things. And it's true, isn't it? And you've known people who could say, oh, I messed up, I did so, and then they did it again. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry, I messed up, and then they did it again, right? You've known that. You've seen it. Recognizing faults and changing our ways, two different things. And so James says, here's what we do. There's kind of 4 parts to this. The beginning of it is submitting ourselves to God. And this idea of submission in this context, this was a military word. This is keeping things in the right order and knowing who's above you. And this is, if they're above you in the army, you do what you're told. So it's not, we get submission all mixed up in a lot of other stuff. But this is, a kind of being subject to someone else, obeying whatever they say, yielding your will to the authority of another person. Fortunately, in this case, it's God and not a person. In submitting to God, that's what allows us to obey God rather than those desires that are at work within us. That's what allows us to be free from that influence. So when we're finding ourselves in conflict with somebody, we have to monitor this because it's going to happen. I mean, it's just we're people. When we find that starting to flare up, we've got to catch ourselves. When we start wanting to win, when we start wanting to prove our point, when we want to come out on top or put someone in their place, we have to think, am I submitting myself to God? This isn't really about that other person. This is not who's in charge here. This is who's in charge here. If we let God be in charge, then his peace will be ruling within us. So we have to start with submission. And then we have to be willing, and this is a hard one, to evaluate our inner motives. To really think. And, I can remember a few times in college, things would be going on, and I'd have to just kind of get off by myself and just think, what just happened? Why did I do that? What was going on? It wasn't necessarily anything terrible, but I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was going on in me, kind of my motivation checks. And we have to be willing to do that. It's not comfortable. It's not fun, but we have to be ready to do that. Or we're just going to be flying blind and letting worldly thinking take over. That's why he says, come near to God. He will come near to you. I mean, God is desiring to be closer. Our desire is what holds that up. If we're far from God, that's on us, not him. And so he's saying, you want to be closer to God? Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. You see? And so, one, we have to recognize ourselves as sinners. If we spend time in denial, thinking we're great people because we go to church or because we're nicer than our neighbor, then we don't have that recognition of sin that allows us to go to God and say, help. When we live in denial and won't admit that we are double-minded sometimes, that we do have worldly thinking at war with the spiritual thinking, then we can't go to God and ask for him to help us. We have to be ready to get ourselves cleaned up. That's the pollution of the world in us. We have to feel the remorse. We have to humble ourselves. Because when we're trying to be self-sufficient, that leads to pride, and that leads to pushing God off the throne and taking it for ourselves. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so we have to be willing to peel away the excuses, the rationalizations, the justifications, and just say, what am I really trying to accomplish here? And does God have anything to do with it? See, that's why it's a hard question. And we must humble ourselves. Submit yourselves to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. See, when we are able to humble ourselves, God can bless us with more grace. Humility does not insist on being right and getting its way. Humility allows us to recognize our own sin, to recognize our double-mindedness, and that allows us to be totally reliant on God as he empties us of self and fills us with him and his Spirit. You can see that's just the polar opposite of my way or the highway. So, not an easy lesson for us to swallow, but such a necessary thing. We just have to recognize that conflict, in so many cases, it arises because we're not letting God lead. We're trying to take charge. We're trying to get what we want and be right and win. And so I hope we'll take the time to really listen. You know, some of us, we just always keep some noise on, always keep busy, because when we sit quietly, then God might say something to us. Take the time to listen, to let God speak. And when it's bad news and that stuff that makes us feel uncomfortable, you know, that we might have done something wrong, don't run from it. Don't try to deny and blame. That's the feeling that allows us to humble ourselves before God. We need that conviction. We need to be willing to humble ourselves before God, and that will allow us to live at peace with each other. We're going to close with a final hymn today. Serve the Lord with gladness. And even these things that are hard, even these things that are so uncomfortable, we should be glad for the chance to feel the bite of conviction, to feel the pain of knowing we were wrong, because that allows us to get right with God. So let's just remember that we don't have to stick up for ourselves. All we have to do is seek the will of God. Let's stand and sing together. Number 495. Well, I think we need to move on from James and do something that makes us feel better about ourselves. Thanks for sticking with me. I mean, it was all necessary, but not necessarily fun to hear what James had to say. But so important to work on these things and make sure that we're dealing with reality. Thank you for joining us here today. May we go forth as people who have the peace of Christ in our hearts. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.